In this video, we'll make a set of process diagrams that are similar to these examples. For me, this was a must on every single one of my presentations, as I think it's one of the easiest and clearest ways you can explain your design process to someone. When you're making these drawings, you'll also find that it really forces you to understand and organize the steps you took throughout the design, which I think is a very valuable thing to have for all of your projects. For this example, we'll be using a SketchUp model for the base of the drawings. What you'll find is the most important thing when you're making process diagrams using a 3D model is how you organize your model file. I've typically found that the more time I spend in my 3D file, making sure that everything is clean, everything is grouped properly, everything is layered properly, really the less time it's going to take to actually finish all of these drawings versus spending extra time in Photoshop or Illustrator. So a good rule of thumb for all your process diagrams is to have some sort of context. So for my project, this is the Google Earth site. And as you can see, what I've done is really focused in on the immediate surroundings of the site. So this context layer really becomes the base for all of my drawings. It's the constant that you see throughout the sequence of diagrams. You really have to be the judge in terms of how much context you actually end up showing for each drawing. Because I zoomed in and I'm only showing a few buildings, it allowed me to go into a little bit more detail in the modeling of these. I've really found that spending a little bit of extra time and adding this level of detail, even to the context, is really worth it because of how much it increases the believability of this set of drawings. You have to be careful though, because if you do go into too much detail and you get too carried away, you'll find that it'll actually hurt the quality of the drawings. So you just have to find that in-between balance. The way I've organized this file is I'm trying to make 6 diagrams. So I have 6 different layers that has the information necessary for each drawing. So as you can see, this easily allows me to turn off the stuff I don't need and turn on the stuff that I need for each export. I also have a few other layers for information that I want to use for multiple diagrams. So for instance, the cars layer, I can turn on and off for whatever diagram I want it to be visible on. Same goes for the trees. And also I think I have a layer called umbrellas because I just wanted to add a little bit more detail to this patio. And then I have my context on the default layer, so it'll be shown for every drawing. So I'll start with making the first diagram. This is just a grid on top of the site, so it's very simple. As you can see, I have a scene saved, which will be the exact same view that I use for each diagram to make sure they're all consistent. Something to note in my scene settings, all I need checked is the camera location. This way, whenever I go back to this scene, it won't reset the layers I have visible, because for each drawing, we're going to have different layers being shown. So it wouldn't make sense to have to reset the layers each time. So in this drawing, I want to show the cars and the trees. So I'm just going to flip on those layers. And now I can begin to set up my file ready to export. I'll start off by switching to the hidden line theme. And before I export my edges, I noticed that my trees have so many unnecessary edges. So I actually don't want the edges of the tree. So I'll shut off that layer before I export the lines. And you notice when I went back to my scene right there, it didn't reset the layers because of the settings we adjusted earlier. Now we'll export our 2D graphic, our line layer. And we're doing a JPEG because we're going to be using Photoshop to do the post-processing. These drawings typically aren't very big, so you really don't have to export a super high quality image. The next thing I'm going to do is export a black and white clay render to overlay on top of my lines. For this, I'm going to use a plugin for SketchUp called Ambient Occlusion. It's from this website called Fluid Interactive. And as you can see, it's just a really quick and easy way to get those soft shadows in your model. And obviously you don't have to use this plugin to achieve this. V-Ray works great also. And then in Rhino 6, you also have the Arctic View mode, which gives you the same result. Doing this simple render pass will give your drawings much more depth. And it's also just a good way to add a little bit more style to them versus just having them be line drawings. So with this plugin, I can do just viewport rendering to make sure my settings are good. And then I'll click on the window render. And whenever I'm doing this, I want to make sure I'm exporting at the exact same quality as my line drawing. So I'll just go back into my export settings and take note of what the pixels are or what the size of the image is. And I'll just insert that into my render view box. So now when I overlay this in Photoshop, they'll line up exactly and I won't have to scale anything. Once this is finished, I can go ahead and save it right next to my first export. The next export that I'm going to do is the coloring for the trees, because for this drawing I actually want my trees to appear to be green. And to do this, all I'm going to do is hide all of my layers besides my tree layer, turn on my color in SketchUp, and then hide edges. So now all I'm exporting is the green color of the trees, which I can then overlay in Photoshop. And of course, I'll make sure that this is the same quality as my other exports. The last export I'm going to do is shadows layer. And this is just going to give me another thing to overlay in Photoshop to play around with and to adjust to make my drawing exactly as I want it to be. So to do this, I'm just going to go into the hidden line mode, turn on my shadows, shut off my edges. And then now, if you'd like, you can adjust the darkness of the shadows, or you can make them lighter. And then, just like the other drawings, we'll export a 2D graphic at the same resolution. Once we export all of our different passes, we can go ahead and go into Photoshop and open each export. And we're just going to go ahead and choose one to be the base layer. I usually just do the ambient occlusion. And now I'm just going to click and drag each of these passes into that file, and then align them to be centered. Once they're all centered, we can select all three of them and change their mode to multiply. That way the white becomes transparent and you can see everything overlaid on top of each other. And then of course you want to make sure that you rename your layers to keep your file as organized as possible. Then I typically like to shut off all the layers except for one and go through each and make any adjustments that are needed. So for the ambient occlusion layer, I'm just going to bump up the brightness because I don't need it to be so dark. And then my trees layer, actually I'm not even going to mess with because I think they look pretty good. And then my lines layer, I'm just going to take the opacity down a little bit because the lines were a little bit too heavy. And then finally my shadows layer, I can adjust the opacity just like the lines and get it to what I think looks best. Now that all my base layers are looking pretty good, I can go ahead and start adding on that second level of detail. So the first thing I want to do is add outlines on my site. So there's kind of two sites for this project. There's the Art Center site, and then there's also kind of a courtyard / park. So for my art center, I'm just going to add a thick red outline like this. And then for the park side, I'm going to add a yellow outline like this. And I'm just very simply using the brush tool, holding down shift and clicking so I get the straight edges. I'm going to add a really, really thin profile line to the parts of the context where my site is actually going behind. Another way you can do this is with a dashed line that just kind of fades out behind the context. The next thing I want to do is add some labels. So to do this, I'm just going to use the text tool in Photoshop, and I just want it to be black. Nothing too fancy. I just want to get the point across that one of these sites is for the art center and the other site is a little park. Now I'm going to transform the text by hitting Control T, and if I hold down Control and grab on to the constraint box points, I can actually click and drag and kind of make this the same perspective as my drawing. And because I have my grid already in the drawing, it makes it really easy to line it up and make it look correct. And now I can do it for the park text as well. And really having them at that perspective kind of adds a really nice effect to the drawing. And I'm going to lighten the opacity a little bit, just so it's not as strong. The last layer that I want to add to this drawing are scale figures. So I'll add a new layer called people. And because the drawing is so small, I really don't have to worry too much about the level of detail they have. So I'm just going to use this brush pack that I have of silhouette people. And I'm just going to place them all around the drawing. And I'm not going to spend too much time about their actual placement. This is more about just adding a little bit more of sense of scale to the drawing. So this one is pretty well finished, so I can go ahead and export it as a JPEG and set it aside for later laying it out in InDesign. And really from here on, it's kind of just rinse and repeat to do the other drawings. Once you get that very first one finished, it kind of gives you a basis to do the other ones. So for this tutorial, I'm just going to show you the process of doing a couple more. So we'll do the fourth diagram in the series. And just like the first one, I'm going to do the different exports. So the first is just the lines export, then the soft shadow export, and then a shadows export. And I'm not going to export the color of the trees for this one because I'm not trying to highlight the trees at all. I kind of want them to fade out. So we'll just do the black and white shadows. Now I can overlay all the drawings in Photoshop, just like before, turning each to multiply and then renaming the layer. And now what you'll see me do here is kind of track back to the first drawing I completed to make sure I'm using the same settings in terms of like the brightness of the shadows, the opacity of the lines, etc., so that you can make them as clear and consistent as possible. One slight adjustment I'm going to make to this diagram is kind of fading out the context, because at this point it's more about the building itself and the form that I'm showing. So to do this, I'll just add a saturation layer and really lighten up the context, and then using the layer mask, I'll kind of paint my form back so that it pops out just a little bit more than the general context. And now I'm realizing that I forgot to import the grid in my lines. So this is just a good example of how you can backtrack. And I'll just go back into my SketchUp model, turn on the necessary layer that I need for my grid, make sure I have my scene selected, just export the lines again. And without having to start over, I can just overlay the lines again and put them back on multiply, lower the opacity, and there you go. I have the grid that I forgot to add before. Another slight adjustment I'm going to make is lightening the lines of the context, just like I did with the soft shadows. So to do this, I'll make a layer mask for the lines layer, and then I'll grab a dark gray and paint over all the context lines. And I'm using a dark gray because if I use black, it'll completely erase the lines. But I just want to lighten them. So to do this, I'll use a dark gray. The last thing I want to do is add a profile line to the form because this is what I want to stick out the most for this drawing. So I'll make a new layer, and I'm just going to do a red outline. I think it's good to use a bright color to make it really pop off the page. So I'll do a pretty thick outline for the pieces of my building that are touching the ground. And then for the upper profile, I'm just going to use kind of 50% thickness. There's really no right or wrong way to do this. You just kind of have to play around with it and see what works best with your drawing. So I also want to add some arrows just to add some annotation to pushing and pulling of this form, but I'm actually going to do that in InDesign. So I'll go ahead and export this as a JPEG and set it aside while I complete the other drawings. So we're going to go ahead and skip to the last diagram, diagram 6. And for this one, it's kind of like the composite drawing. So it's my complete building inside the site with landscape, with all the trees, all the cars. And it's really just the finished final image for my project. And like I said, it's just rinse and repeat of the steps that I did previously. So we can really kind of speed this up. But it's just exporting the 2D lines, exporting an ambient occlusion pass, exporting the color of the trees, and finally exporting the shadows. So now you can really understand the importance of having that clean 3D model because of all the different exports and passes that you have to do to make these high quality drawings. Having the ability to control what you want to export and when you want to export it is really, really important to this process. And once you get in the habit of working like this, all of these things just kind of become second nature, and you don't even really have to think about it. You know exactly what content is necessary to pull from your 3D models to compose each of these drawings. So just like before, I'm opening all of my SketchUp exports, overlaying them, changing them to multiply, and then adding the adjustment layers as necessary to keep them consistent with the other drawings. A specific change or adjustment I need to make this one is actually hiding some of the trees that ended up kind of covering some of the context. So to do this, I'm just going to add a layer mask and then paint over in black the parts of the trees that I want to hide. Now I want to add a little bit of green to where some grass might be. To do this, I'm just going to add a new layer and call it grass. And while my lines layer is selected, I can use my magic wand tool and select where this grass needs to go. And something important to note here is because I hid my trees whenever I exported my lines, I don't have to worry about the tree lines interfering with my selection. And I noticed that the way the trees look kind of changes whenever there's the green color under them. So I'm just going to add a layer mask to my grass level and really quickly just paint out over the trees where that grass is to bring back some of the life to the trees. And finally, because this is kind of that finished drawing, I want to include scale figures, so I add a people layer. And just like my first diagram, I'm just going to kind of paint these quickly to give the drawing a sense of scale. Now I can go ahead and export this as a JPEG, just like the other ones, and get ready to lay them out in InDesign. So now we can fast forward to having all 6 diagrams complete. And as you can see, because they're all the exact same size, they line up very nicely and are easy to lay out in InDesign. Now I want to go ahead and add some of the annotation that I mentioned earlier. So for this one, I need to add some arrows. To do this, it's actually pretty easy in InDesign, and sometimes I like it. Sometimes I think it's better to do it in Illustrator or Photoshop. But to do it in InDesign, what I like to do is put all my images on one layer and then add a new layer and call it Annotate, so I can lock my images. And anything I do on top of them, I don't have to worry about selecting the actual image. So something I like to do is kind of create a library of different arrows and different fill patterns in whatever program I'm using. So for this, I have some arrows that I found to work pretty well with process diagrams like this. So as you can see, I'm just going to copy those in and then adjust them to the drawing exactly how I need it. There are plenty of different ways to add arrows like this in InDesign. It's kind of like Illustrator. Sometimes I like to copy and paste them. Other times I'll use the pen tool and draw whatever line I need like this. And then I'll click I and select whatever style line that I want to be transferred to that line. And then for this drawing, I actually want to add this fill pattern. So I'm just going to outline this space with my pen tool, and then grab my eyedropper tool and select that fill, just so I can kind of highlight the space that my arrows are making. So I'll fast forward. I added the other arrows to my other diagrams that I needed them for. And as you can see, they're nice and separated on their respective layers. Now I'm going to add a text layer, and I'm just going to use some text that I use for one of my previous drawings. And just like my arrows, I have it archived because I know this font style, the font size, it all worked previously. So it's a really good starting point, at least for these. So I can just copy and populate it really quickly, and then obviously I can change it later if I need to. Alrighty, so here are the finished process diagrams. And as you probably noticed, I laid these out on an 11 by 17 sheet in InDesign, which is kind of like a portfolio spread, I guess. But even if I was making a poster presentation with these diagrams, I would do the same thing, because I like to have kind of like a base file where I store the actual drawings. So then what I'll do is literally just copy and paste these drawings out of this file and put them onto whatever poster size that I'm using. And then of course you can always adjust the size on the poster. But yeah, I hope this video was some help for you, and thanks for watching.